Building a better Bay Area. Moving forward, finding solutions. This is ABC 7 News.
Hi there, I'm Kristen Z. You're watching Getting Answers live on ABC 7. We ask experts your questions every day at 3 to get answers for you in real time. Today, after the school board recall, San Francisco voters must now decide whether to recall District Attorney Chesa Boudin. How might the recent anti-Asian attacks influence the outcome? A reporter with our media partner, the San Francisco Standard, will be joining us. But first, there is a growing list of sanctions being imposed on Russia. The ultra-wealthy in Russia are getting hit directly in their access to money. But everyday citizens there are also affected. ABC News reporter Rena Roy has more.
As fighting intensifies in Ukraine, Russia essentially cut off from the Western world. The U.S. announcing new sanctions against Russian oligarchs, blocking their travel to the U.S. and also targeting their relatives, adding to consequences they're already facing.
Today I'm announcing that we're adding dozens of names to the list, including one of Russia's wealthiest billionaires, choking off access to technology as well as cutting off access to the global financial system.
Russian President Vladimir Putin also being sanctioned. Some oligarchs now starting to publicly call for an end to the war.
The deal Putin made with this country more or less is, I'll make you more or less prosperous, and I'll take away your freedoms and you won't complain. That deal is now broken.
Meantime, major airplane manufacturers are no longer providing service or parts for Russian aircraft, which experts say will have an unprecedented impact on Russia's economy, potentially bringing their aviation industry to a halt. Boeing joining the growing list of Western companies cutting ties with Russia, including Apple, Nike, General Motors, our parent company Disney, the National Hockey League, and TikTok. The sanctions impacting everyday citizens. Long lines outside of banks as people try to withdraw money. The ruble continuing to lose value against the dollar, with the U.S. and European allies barring some Russian banks from the international payment system, SWIFT. Many now calling on the West to sanction Russian oil and gas.
I'm all for that. Ban it.
Ban the oil.
Ban the oil come from Russia.
Oil and gas prices already rising.
The volatility in the oil markets is a direct result of the fact that President Putin invaded Ukraine.
President Biden has emphasized the U.S. is trying to avoid driving up energy prices even more in Europe and the U.S. For that reason, stopping short of banning Russian gas and oil imports. The White House saying that could actually benefit President Putin. Rena Roy, ABC News, New York.
Former ambassador to the United Nations and more recently, National Security Advisor to President Trump, John Bolton, says the U.S. should have imposed sanctions on Russia before the invasion. He sat down with me today for a one-on-one conversation on Vladimir Putin's end goal, why Mr. Trump admired him, and what the Biden administration should do now. Ambassador Bolton, thank you for joining us today. The U.S. is not sending troops, but in addition to economic sanctions, we're now sending weapons to Ukraine so they can counter Russian attacks. Is that enough, in your opinion? Will that work?
No, I don't think so. It wasn't enough even before the Russians invaded. And I think people should understand that the failure of our policy was fundamentally the failure to deter Vladimir Putin from engaging in the invasion in the first place. We were shipping weapons to Ukraine then, we were threatening sanctions, but the credibility of our threat was minimal given that Russia had invaded Georgia in 2008, had invaded Crimea before in 2014. We just withdrawn from Afghanistan. And so we had no credibility. And I think what we should have done was impose costs on Putin before the invasion to show we were serious and to do a number of things that might have created deterrence that would have led him not to invade. But nobody should think that, well, it's too bad he's invaded, but we're imposing strict sanctions, everything's fine. Everything's not fine. We are failing every day this conflict continues.
Everything is not fine. In fact, right now, even though Putin has met up with unexpectedly strong resistance, its military is gaining ground in southern Ukraine. People are getting out. It is bombarding key cities really hard now. How long do you think Ukrainian forces can hold out?
You know, it's an important question, of course. I don't think we know. I think Putin certainly believed that hostilities would be basically over by now. And the Russian military has not only met really heroic resistance by the Ukrainian forces, but has suffered from its own logistical problems. I think they've suffered from a very bad strategy from their own perspective at the beginning, but inexorably here because they know that President Biden said well before the invasion that there was no prospect of American military involvement, that the only thing they have to fear is the Ukrainian army. NATO is not going to participate in this, and Putin will bring to bear the forces he's had around Ukraine. They're just really some still now just coming into the country. And I'm very much afraid he's just going to grind the Ukrainian military into the ground and much of Ukraine along with it.
That is one possible option, but looking at the fact that he's taking bigger losses than he expected, is there something the democratic nations can present as sort of a diplomatic face-saving off-ramp for Putin?
Well, let's take first the losses that he's sustained, and we don't know for sure what they are. Let's assume they're close to what the Ukrainian government claims. I don't think Putin thinks they're large. I don't think he's got the same value on human life that we do, and I think his cost-benefit analysis is based on different values. He said to me several times in my meetings with him, when we disagreed on something, you have your logic, we have ours, we'll see which one prevails. I think now to offer him off-ramps would simply encourage more violence. He thinks we're negotiating from a position of weakness. He's not where he wants to be at this point, but I don't think he's going to negotiate seriously until he gets his objectives, whatever those are, and we don't really know those for sure. I have my views, others have theirs. These negotiations that are taking place now between Ukraine and Russian diplomats on the Belarus border is pure theater.
So what do you think is his end goal, and what means might he get or take or resort to get there?
He's going to use force, and he's going to succeed because unless the Russian army totally collapses, he will simply outgun and weaponize the Ukrainian forces. I think what his real objective is to take control of the culturally Russian parts of the country, the linguistic, where Russia predominates, where the Eastern Orthodox faith predominates, as opposed to the Ukrainian Roman Catholic parts of the country. And that means basically much of the eastern part of the country and the South. And in the South, especially, he's very close to achieving his goal, which includes total control of the north shore of the Black Sea, to cut the rest of Ukraine off from access to the sea, to landlock whatever is left of the country, which would leave it economically very, very squeezed over the long term.
Knowing Putin in your interactions with him, how real do you think is his threat of resorting to nuclear weapons, something that he has sort of hinted at by escalating their nuclear response level, something that President Biden has not responded in kind to? But how real do you think is that threat?
Well, anytime a nuclear power does something that seems threatening with its nuclear weapons, you have to take it seriously. But what Putin ordered isn't very clear, and it's not very clear that the Russian nuclear forces have changed their posture in response to it. I think you try to evaluate threats like this as realistically as you can, because otherwise, if Putin gets what he wants by simply mentioning the magic words nuclear weapons, he's got enormous leverage over us. I think, in fact, that this is essentially a bluff. I think it's intended to boost the morale of his own people and his deployed forces to show we're really taking this seriously. And I think it's intended to intimidate snowflakes in the West who would worry about any mention of nuclear threat. It requires constant evaluation. Right now, I think it's a bluff.
All right, we'll take a short break, but when we come back, the rest of our conversation with Ambassador Bolton, including whether President Trump's withholding of military aid to Ukraine factored into this conflict. We'll be right back. All right, thanks for watching, everybody. We're going to prepare our next round for you and be right back. Some breaking news for you. In their second round of talks, Russia and Ukraine have just agreed on some humanitarian corridors with possible ceasefires for refugees to flee to safety. Right now, more of our conversation from today with former National Security Advisor John Bolton. We posed the question, would Putin have taken the course of action under the Trump presidency? Some Republicans say Putin would not have dared to do this while Mr. Trump was in office. Do you agree or disagree with that, having been appointed, I should mention, to the UN ambassador by President Trump?
Well, I was National Security Advisor for President Trump, but look, he barely knew where Ukraine was on the map. I think Putin saw that Trump was having a negative effect on NATO. I think he believed that the unfortunate exchange between Trump and Ukraine during the summer of 2019, where Trump held up $250 million of security assistance so that Ukraine could find the Hillary Clinton server that was apparently hidden in Ukraine, or find out what Hunter Biden's income derived in Ukraine was very damaging to the new Zelensky government. And because of our extensive campaign all through 2020, Zelensky and the Ukrainian government couldn't really develop a good bilateral relationship with the United States. I think Putin was essentially waiting for the campaign to be over, and I think he would have tested Trump at that time. And as I've said before, I think Russian forces would be in Kiev already.
Okay. Yes, and thank you for correcting me. You were, of course, appointed to the UN position by former President George W. Bush. You said Trump barely knew anything about Ukraine. Like, how so? Examples?
Well, one example of related with regard to Finland, he once asked John Kelly, his chief of staff at the time, if Finland was part of Russia. He didn't understand the history of Ukraine. He didn't understand the independence really over the last 30 years. He didn't understand the strategic issues at stake, and he didn't care about any of them. He cared about that Hillary Clinton server. Maybe it was a Democratic National Committee server, because he saw things not through a philosophical perspective, not through an historical perspective, but through the perspective of whether or not it benefited Donald Trump politically.
I mean, along those veins, do you have any insight into why former President Trump admired or expressed admiration for President Putin? You know, he continued to praise his strength even after the invasion has started, although I should say in the past couple of days he has said, Putin, you should stop. But what's behind that?
You know, he has always had an affinity for strongmen kinds of leaders, whether it's Putin or Xi Jinping or Kim Jong-un or Recep Erdogan of Turkey. He said once in 2018, when we were leaving for a NATO summit and then a meeting with Theresa May, then Prime Minister of Great Britain, and then the Helsinki summit with Putin, he said to the reporters as we were waiting to get on the helicopter on the White House lawn, you know, I think the meeting with Putin may turn out to be the easiest one of all. Who would have ever thought that? And, you know, the answer is the only person who ever thought that was Donald Trump.
You know, the first time a lot of people here in America had heard of Volodymyr Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, was in relationship to the story of President Trump delaying military aid to Ukraine, withholding nearly $400 million to get a quote-unquote favor, information on Hunter Biden. What was the impact of that episode, if any, on what's happening today?
Well, I think it did have an effect on Putin's assessment of not just of Trump, but of the country more generally, that they didn't fully understand the nature of the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. They didn't understand what Putin's aspirations were. As I said a moment ago, Zelensky had been unable during this entire period to develop a good relationship with the President of the United States. He felt distant from the Trump administration, and he certainly had not had much time to develop a relationship with the Biden administration. And honestly, it didn't do him any good, since the Biden administration hasn't acted effectively in this context. So this distance of Ukraine from the potential of a closer relationship with what could have been its principal ally could only encourage Putin to think that that indeed there was distance between Ukraine and the United States, and he would try to exploit it.
I see. Well, the European Union seems to be moving toward admitting Ukraine as a member. How soon could that happen, and would it make an immediate difference?
I'm not sure how soon it will happen. Never give credence to any statements from the European Union about how fast they're going to move on anything. It is primarily an economic and political union and has no real military capability to the extent that its individual member states have that. They utilize it through NATO. And I think the EU's decision-making really makes it less than the sum of its parts. I think it's economically a plus for Ukraine if they can get in, but to protect their independence and sovereignty, they need help from NATO, and they're not getting enough of it.
Is the United Nations powerless or able to do something here? I mean, with China and Russia in the Security Council, obviously, it is difficult for it to effectively do something right now, right, other than walking out on a Russian diplomat's speech.
Right. The U.S. and others tried to pass a resolution in the Security Council a few days ago, very critical of Russia. Russia vetoed it. China did not cast a veto. It abstained, but so did India. So you have the two most populous countries on earth abstaining. So did the United Arab Emirates, because they were irritated with the administration for not labeling the Houthi rebels as a terrorist group, Houthis in Yemen, firing at civilian airports and civilian targets in the UAE and Saudi Arabia. So this showed the Security Council is gridlocked. The UN General Assembly has just passed a resolution critical of Russia by an overwhelming majority. That means nothing. Nothing will happen as a consequence of that. So I think the main UN actor now, and it could be a very important one, will be the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, who has estimated today, in fact, that there are over 1 million Ukrainians refugees now in other European countries, and another million displaced persons, as they're called, within Ukraine. So you've got 2 million Ukrainian citizens outside their homes, and the projection is that total could go as high as 5 million refugees in across Ukraine's borders. That's more than 10% of the population of the entire country. This could be a real humanitarian tragedy.
I want to pull back the lens to finish this conversation, and that is, we all know there are long-term consequences of this war in terms of the world order. Given that, what do you think the U.S. needs to do right now to lead and to set the world on the right path?
Well, I think people need to understand that the flimsy notions that there's a rules-based international order are simply false. Nobody gave the memo to Vladimir Putin, or if they did, he didn't read it.
Our conversation today with former UN Ambassador John Bolton. Coming up next, we'll be talking to our media partner, the San Francisco Standard, about how Asian American voters may have a big impact on the recall of San Francisco DA Chesa Boudin. We'll be right back. All right, folks, which shot do you want to see? Our director has lined up an awesome shot for you of the kind of cloudy, slightly rainy day we're getting today, which is unusual. Spencer Christian working up your forecast for the 4 o'clock show, so be sure to join us then. We'll be right back. ABC7 is excited about our partnership with the digital news site, the San Francisco Standard. Part of building a better Bay Area here at ABC7 is highlighting those who are working toward the same mission of improving the quality of life for everyone. The Standard's deep and insightful reporting on the challenges in San Francisco does just that. With the San Francisco School Board recall over, with 3 board members voted out, the city now turns its attention to the next recall election in June, that of the progressive District Attorney Chesa Boudin. Joining us to talk about how this race may be influenced by the newly mobilized voters in the school board recall is the Standard's reporter, Han Lee. Han, welcome back to the show.
Hi, Kristen. Thank you for having me.
So, as we've seen in your reporting, one group that turned out in large numbers in the school board recall is Asian Americans concerned about education. Now, your new article, just published on the Standard's website, says the same group may influence the DA's recall as well. How so?
Yes, so we've been in the pandemic for 2 years, and we've seen the National Stop Asian Hate movement. And also on the news, there are violence, crimes against Asian American. So there are some political momentum in the community to get engaged in political process. And now they're facing a recall option in front of them, the recall against San Francisco District Attorney Chesa Boudin. So there might be some political momentum there.
Okay. We saw an over 500% increase in attacks on Asian Americans in San Francisco last year. Asian Americans, of course, are not monolithic and have a diverse range of views. I would imagine some also support Boudin and his approach. Have you found a segment of the population that does not tie Boudin's prosecution style to the uptick in the attacks?
Yeah, so I did interview a lot of community members and sources for this story, and I found this is a really divisive issue, but still, as I just mentioned, there's some political momentum in the city, in the Chinese American community right now because of all the crimes and all the public safety and their concerns about the crimes in the city. So yes, there are 2 sides, and supporters of the San Francisco DA Boudin are saying, you know, the blame from the community members is unfair to him, but also like the recall chair, Mary Zhang, which is also Asian American female, she said, you know, the DA's office has been mishandling a lot of case involving Asian American victims.
And therefore making the environment less safe for Asian Americans in the city. All right. Did his critics make their feelings known at the recent Chinese New Year parade?
Yes, so in the Chinese Lunar New Year parade, there are protesters along District Attorney Boudin, and they're just very upset about his office and his administration. District Attorney Boudin was running a progressive criminal justice reform platform in 2019 and won the election. And he's also being accused of soft on crime. So he's becoming a target and also being blamed for what happened now in the city.
Is there a commonality in the funding between these 2 recalls, the school board one and Chesa Boudin's?
I think there are generally people against the process of the recall because they think, you know, recall, they don't have a choice. They would prefer a regular election because during those elections, you will have a choice. You will know who you can pick. But for the recall, it's only yes or no to recall, and then they will hand the power to the mayor because the mayor can appoint the successors.
All right. How big of a voting block or percentage would you say are Asian Americans in the city?
Yeah, it's a complicated issue. So I think in the school board recall, we see there's big momentum in the community, but the data shows the turnout rate in the Asian American neighborhoods are just average. But there's more complicated, and we can look into the data in the future too. But also in the district attorney recall election, there might be a broader coalition because public safety, the crime concerns has impact on everyone in the city, right? But the school board is mostly about education issues.
So real quickly, we have about 30 seconds, but what did Boudin's office tell you in terms of your article here? And what kind of efforts are they making to win over Asian American voters?
Yes, I reached out to the Boudin anti-recall campaign, and they told us Boudin has been very vocal about, you know, Asian Americans community and also helping the community feel safe. And he hired a bilingual victim services chief and also charging those hate crimes involving Asian American victims too.
All right. Han Lee, thank you so much. Don't go away. We'll take a short break, but continue our conversation over on Facebook Live. But we do have links to the San Francisco Standard's other original reporting on our website, abc7news.com, and to watch more ABC7 segments featuring the San Francisco Standard's city-focused journalism. Check out our ABC7 Bay Area streaming TV app and scroll down to the San Francisco Standard shelf. We'll be right back. Han, thanks for sticking with us. We have a couple more minutes here on Facebook Live to finish our conversation. Did you take a look at crime statistics? And I realize that numbers are just numbers and they're meant to be interpreted, and there's so many factors influencing numbers. But any indication that the city is less safe, if you will, by the typical metrics under Boudin's watch versus, before?
Yes, so there's a lot of investigative report about crime data and also District Attorney Boudin's office prosecution rate. So I think in the pandemic, there are ups and downs of different category of crimes. And also for District Attorney Boudin's office, the prosecution on certain type of crimes are higher than his predecessor, and there are certain lower than his predecessor. So it's a really complicated issue. It depends on how you interpret it. But for sure, because of all the media reports and those viral videos on social media about a crime, so I think there is a real concern of the residents here. They feel unsafe or less safe than it used to be.
Is San Francisco much different from other big cities in terms of both the type of crimes that have gone up and, the prosecution of certain types of crimes? Or is there a trend amongst American big cities that we've looked at that seems to be veering away from kind of the, prosecute and put people in jail, perspective and that approach to being a DA?
Yeah, so I think nationwide there is a movement of, criminal justice reform, like more progressive about like restorative justice. And also, I think in San Francisco here, District Attorney Boudin, he won in 2019 in a really narrow win. And his platform is about criminal justice reform, like decrease the mass incarceration, and also restorative justice on diversion programs, mental health treatment. So I think that's what's being discussed right now. And
well, Han, thank you so much for your insight. As always, we can keep talking. We'll welcome you back another time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us on this interactive show, Getting Answers. Today, we talked to former U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, John Bolton. We'll be here every weekday at 3 on air and on live stream answering your questions. World News Tonight is coming up next, and I'll see you back here at 4.